Hello and welcome back to another episode of Embracing Data. I'm Marian Vidal-Fernandez, and today I have the pleasure to speak with the Honorable Dr. Andrew Leigh, Assistant Minister for Productivity, Competition, Charities and Treasury. Before entering politics, Andrew was a professor of economics at the Australian National University. Andrew, welcome to Embracing Data, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Marian. Really lovely to talk to another fellow data nerd and lover of long-distance running.
Thank you. Yeah, we have two things in common now.
Absolutely.
Andrew, you've come from publishing academic papers on public policy issues, such as inequality, to shaping policy, and even writing best-selling books about them. What inspired that transition from academic to policymaker and author?
Well, in economics, as you probably know, the value of books has been declining basically ever since Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. Economists tend to communicate in articles, not books. But most regular people don't read journal articles, they read books. And so if you want to have a conversation with a wider audience, books are where it's at. I've really enjoyed, since I came into Parliament, trying to be a bit of a bridge between the world of ideas and the world of power. And writing books is one way I seek to do that. In some sense, to act as a bit of a transmission belt between my old world of universities and my new world of politics.
I think you've achieved that really well, Andrew. Thanks also for joining this podcast, which kind of tries also to bring economics to a broader audience. In Embracing Data, we usually dive into a single research paper, but today we're doing something a little different, and we're talking about a whole book. But before we get into the book, I can't help it, but I like to start with your own research. You and your co-authors a while ago sent thousands of CVs with different applicant characteristics to employers here in Australia to measure hiring discrimination. What did you find, and what drew you to using experiments to understand the world?
So this is a style of study that's become quite common, which is to measure hiring discrimination by race or ethnicity through sending fake CVs and varying the name on the CV. And the notion is that our name tells people a lot about who we are. And if you're just measuring discrimination at the callback stage, you can get quite a nice experimental estimate out of this. One of the early studies are done in Australia in the early 1980s, and my co-authors, Alana Su-Navratil and Alison Booth and I, were keen to follow up and see how discrimination had changed. We picked Anglo names as a base category, and then Indigenous names, Italian names, Chinese names, and Middle Eastern names. And one of the striking findings out of it was that there was a sort of melting pot effect. We barely saw any discrimination against people with Italian Australian names. Indeed, if they were going for hospitality jobs in Melbourne, they seemed to get more callbacks. But we saw very significant discrimination against people with Indigenous, Chinese and Middle Eastern names, with the strongest discrimination being against people with Chinese names in Sydney, who had to put in almost 50% more CVs in order to get the same number of callbacks.
Wow, that's a big gap between something as simple as a name that does not necessarily tell anything about how good you're going to be in your job. After having experimented with experiments and then moving into politics, your book Randomistas takes readers on a gripping journey through the world of randomized controlled trials, or RCTs as we know them, showing how they've transformed disciplines such as diverse as medicine, education, politics, economics, and business. So for listeners who might not be familiar with this approach, could you explain in simple terms what makes randomized controlled trials so powerful and what are their key elements?
Yeah, so let's take a simple example. When COVID hit, people were keen to discover what would be the best treatments initially. This is in the pre-vaccine stage, and we were just looking at how to treat COVID. And one of the early findings was that the drug hydroxychloroquine seemed to be effective in alleviating the symptoms of COVID. People who were given hydroxychloroquine had better outcomes than people who weren't. But then researchers said, well, what if we did a randomised trial and we randomly allocate people who with exactly the same characteristics to either get hydroxychloroquine or not get hydroxychloroquine? And when they did that, they found that the treatment had no effect, and indeed, given its serious side effects, seemed to be a real problem in the attempted treatment of COVID. What's known as selection effect, plagues a whole lot of other problems. So, for example, if you were to compare people who are light drinkers with people who are non-drinkers or heavy drinkers, then you find that the light drinkers seem to have better health outcomes. But when you use random variation, it turns out that that's all a selection effect. And in fact, light drinking has a mild negative effect on outcomes. It is better to be a teetotaler. Only randomized trials can help you tease out causation from correlation in a really rigorous, effective way.
So basically, in the COVID example, people who chose to take the treatment might have been anyway healthier otherwise. And that's why, without a randomized controlled trial, we could lead to the conclusion that there is a positive impact of that medicine when the randomized controlled trial was done. And all those two people in those two groups were identical, apparently identical. No, we don't have twins. We wish we had. Then there was no impact between the treatment and no treatment.
Precisely. And if the selection was all on things that we could observe, it would be fine. We could hold those things constant and run multiple regression, and we'd find out the truth. The trouble comes when it's not just that younger people are getting hydroxychloroquine or people with lower BMIs are getting hydroxychloroquine, but it's people with more of a sparkle in their eyes and a spring in their step. When the selection is on unobservables in econometric jargon, that you get into real strife. And so that's why in medicine these days, if you want to get a new drug on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, typically you have to go through randomized trials. And yet in social policy, randomized trials are still relatively rare. Only about 2% of all evaluations, according to a recent report from the think tank CEDA, are randomized. The other 98% of evaluations that government does use a non-randomized methodology.
We will come back to that because even though they are recent in social policy, randomized controlled trials could probably be very powerful. In Randomistas, you distinguish between field experiments and randomized controlled trials. Could you explain the difference between these two types of studies and in what context each might be more suitable?
Yeah, so there's a whole spectrum of randomized trials. You can do randomized trials in a laboratory where you have students giving different treatments. You can do them in the field where you might be collaborating with a credit card company that offers different credit offers to the same group of people. Or you might be operating in a medical context in which people are invited to join a randomized trial and then selected into either the treatment or the control group. Each of these have their strengths and their weaknesses. To the extent that people are opting into an experiment, you still get true causal estimates, but you might be getting causal estimates on an unrepresentative slice of the population. And so researchers are now thinking much more rigorously about, for example, are a lot of our psychology conclusions based on just how psychology students behave? Or how do we make sure that in medicine we're not just testing drugs on men in advanced countries, but we're testing drugs on a much broader multi-ethnic population?
So basically, what you're saying is that even well-designed experiments need to be mindful of the way that those results can be extended to other populations that are not included in those experiments, and how they need to be careful about that and be kind of modest in the extrapolation of the results when they are not able, for budgetary reasons or because there aren't people who want to join the experiment, to everyone in Australia, let's say.
Precisely. Modesty is always a good thing, and indeed I think modesty underpins rigorous evaluation. You should hold your conclusions lightly and be willing to allow evidence to change your mind. Generalizability doesn't just apply to randomized trials, of course. If you're doing a before-after study in Sweden, then you need to think about whether or not the results of that before-after study are going to extrapolate to Senegal. That's also true if you're doing a randomized trial in Sweden and thinking about whether it applies in Senegal. But improving rigor does make it more likely that you've got the right answer for Sweden, and therefore puts you in a better spot in thinking about its impact in other parts of the world.
Thank you. In the book, you often also talk about the importance of the counterfactual. So that is understanding what would have happened without that intervention to that individual in the treatment. Could you please unpack that idea a little bit?
So, Marian, my favourite metaphor for the counterfactual is the movie Sliding Doors, in which there is two versions of her life according to whether Gwyneth Paltrow catches a train or doesn't catch a train. And the thing is, about most of our lives, we only get to live one version. Unless you're Gwyneth Paltrow in Sliding Doors, or unless you're reading a Choose Your Own Adventure book, you only have one pathway. And so if we're to test the causal impact of an intervention, it's really useful to bring luck into play, to allow luck to determine who's in the treatment and who's in the control group. And it turns out that if you've got a sufficiently large population and you toss coins to decide who's in which group, then not only will you end up with half in the heads group and half in the tails group, but the heads and tails groups will be similar in terms of age, income, education, and unmeasurables such as deep down motivation or the ambition of their grandparents. Having that balance between the treatment and control groups then can give you a confidence that if you see a difference after you put in place the treatment, then you know that that difference is caused by the treatment.
Well, thank you for that clarification. So basically, you're trying to kind of have twins in each group or people that are as close as possible so that we could conclude that those changes that we've introduced in the treatment are actually the cause of that change in whatever outcome we are interested in looking at.
Beautifully put.
One thing I really liked at the beginning of your book was this story that discussed how the course of Australian history could have been changed because of an experiment. It could have changed the naval history and success. Can you tell us a bit about that fascinating story?
So James Lind was a 32-year-old surgeon who decided that he would run an experiment to figure out how to keep scurvy at bay. Scurvy was the great scourge of expeditions in the age of sail. More than 2 million sailors died from scurvy, far more than died from skirmishes, storms, or shipwrecks. It was estimated that during Britain's 7 Years' War, you had a 1% chance of dying in action if you're a British naval sailor, but a 72% chance of dying from scurvy. So James Lind runs an experiment where he takes 12 sailors, he randomises them across to a whole lot of different treatments that were popular in the day: cider, sulfuric acid, vinegar, seawater, a whole bunch of herbs. And the final group, the lucky group, we now know, got 2 oranges and 1 lemon. And then a week later, he followed through the results and found that those who'd had citrus were up and about and the rest hadn't improved. The British Navy was one of the first navies in the world to adopt the citrus as a treatment for scurvy. And indeed, Captain Cook's exploratory voyage to Australia stumbled upon ways of keeping scurvy at bay. He didn't seem to be influenced by Lind. Lind's write-up took a while to get accepted, but he sort of stumbled upon appropriate scurvy treatments like sauerkraut, malt, and lemon juice. As a result, Cook managed to reach Australia, raise the English flag, and you can well imagine that if the British Navy hadn't managed to find a treatment for scurvy, we might be having this conversation in Portuguese, Spanish, or French.
I'd love to have it in Spanish, to be honest. Now, when Randomistas came out in 2018, it seems like ages ago now, you discussed some big social experiments that were still ongoing at the time, such as trials of universal basic income in Finland and Africa. Since then, we've seen massive technological changes, especially with AI, threatening traditional jobs. Looking back, what did those experiments teach us about universal income, and how do you think they could be part of the solution or not to the economic disruptions that we're facing at the moment?
So the randomised trials on universal basic income are really important because people have very strong priors about the impact of UBI. And without strong evidence, you can't be sure as to what the causal impact will be. What we've seen out of the studies in Finland is that people are slightly happier, about 0.5 points higher on a 10-point scale of life satisfaction. but we don't see any significant impact on employment. People in the treatment group worked only a little bit more. And then there's the studies in the United States, randomized trials in Texas and Illinois. We see people being less likely to run short of groceries, spending a little bit more on children, but no significant improvement on educational outcomes, on physical health, and indeed a small fall in employment levels. So that punctures the caricature that universal basic income was going to be a calamity, but also it punctures the idea that it was going to be a cure-all. It seemed to help households manage shocks and reduce stress, but it didn't seem to resolve some of those deep inequalities around housing or health or education.
Well, so again, I guess, so that's really interesting. And it also highlights how decisions in politics and science can work together to find solutions or know the pros and the cons to things that worry us at the moment as a society. So how do you think, Andrew, the potential threat to job losses through AI could be tested or should be tested in a randomized controlled trial format so that we could draw policy recommendations in terms of how best manage these potential threats?
That's a great question. We've already had a few randomized trials around rolling AI out for particular occupational groups. Some of the studies that provide AI to coders and consultants give us a sense of the magnitude of the productivity boost between 25 and 40% straight off the bat. What I haven't seen so much is randomized trials which have looked at AI training and the extent to which that might provide a bit of a cushion among workers who are looking to adopt or to shift into jobs where they're working in occupations that are complementary rather than supplementary to AI. But this is an area with enormous uncertainty, a lot of debate around appropriate policy responses. So it does seem to be a natural area for experimentation. Australia has the Australian Centre for Evaluation, which stands ready to work with those who are keen to put in place rigorous randomised trials like these.
So if you had to pick just one experiment from any field that you think every policymaker or researcher should use as a benchmark for good experimental design, which one would it be and why?
So there's a great study which looks at deworming in Kenya, and I love it because it not only got its researchers Nobel Prizes, but also looked at an inexpensive, light touch health intervention in terms of what it would do for educational outcomes. And it found that providing deworming treatments to Kenyan students was enormously beneficial to how they performed at school. And then what's lovely about it, Marian, is they continue to follow up the subjects of the study, and they look through not only their outcomes, but also what happens to their kids. And they're able to see impacts for their children as well. So it's a really great example of helping us think about how we might use health interventions to move educational outcomes, but also the importance of long-term follow-up data.
On the flip side, your book also acknowledges that RCTs have their critics and people who argue that they either oversimplify social problems or ignore ethical dimensions. What do you think are the strongest criticisms of RCT, and how do you respond to them?
I think it's vital that people know that they're in an experiment wherever possible, and that experiments go through rigorous ethical evaluation. So take one that I is maybe on the margin. The experiment that was done in India to see what the impact would be of paying Indian students who get their driver's license faster. Essentially, the researchers wanted to know about corruption, but they decided they couldn't actually ask the treatment group to bribe people. Instead, they told the treatment group there'd be a bonus if they got their license faster, and lo and behold, many of them bribed the driving instructor. Now, you might think that putting a whole bunch of untrained drivers out on the road, having bribed driving instructors was deeply unethical. But the reason that the ethics panel approved it was that all of the participants then got proper driver training afterwards. And so they were safer than they would have otherwise been. And yes, there was money which flowed through to corrupt driving instructors, but the researchers and the ethics panel took the view that that was a cost worth bearing in order to better understand the impact of corruption in India and in other contexts where bribery of driving instructors occurs. Of course, it's not just a phenomenon in India. I got my driving licence in Sydney at a centre where about 6 months after I'd got my driving licence, without any bribes, I should say, driver's licence testers were dismissed for accepting bribes.
Oh, wow. That's a bit shocking. You think those things only happen somewhere else and they are around the corner. All right. So now moving to your everyday life as an assistant minister, could you provide an example where RCTs are used in government at the moment?
We did a really nice light touch randomised trial of super prescribers. So these are doctors who prescribe antibiotics at a much higher rate than other doctors. It's easy to understand why a doctor might do it. When you have a patient come in and they want your help, they're often much happier if you send them away with a prescription than if you send them away empty-handed and say, go to bed early, look after yourself, drink plenty of water, and you'll soon get better. But overprescription of antibiotics is a social problem. It can lead to superbugs, to antibiotic resistance. And so there was a randomised trial conducted by the Australian government that just sent out informational letters to those who were in the top tier of super prescribers. It found that there was a significant drop in overprescribing of antibiotics as a result of receiving this letter, and that the study easily passed a cost-benefit test because the gains from less overprescribing were much larger than the very low cost of just sending out the letters.
That shows how a simple change can make big differences, and testing them can show us to what extent it can improve taxpayers' welfare. As someone who has moved from academic research to policymaking, what's been the biggest challenge in trying to bring an evidence-based mindset into politics?
So one of the challenges is to ensure that people are comfortable around the ethical dimension. When there is already a program in place and we're confident that it works, you can easily make the case that it's unethical to run a randomised trial in which a group of people are arbitrarily excluded. So we found ourselves looking for opportunities where new programs are being rolled out or existing programs are being expanded, and we can use a randomised rollout as a way of learning more about the program. In this sense, we're taking a leaf out of one of the famous randomised trials in international development, which occurred in Mexico with the Progresa conditional cash transfer payments. It was about to be rolled out across 500 Mexican villages when researchers said to the government, "You're going to roll this out over 2 years anyway. Why don't we randomise which 250 villages get it in year one and which 250 villages get it in year two?" At the end of the program, everyone had gotten the conditional cash transfer payment just like they were promised, but researchers were able to measure the short-term impact of the intervention. That led to conditional cash transfer programs being adopted in dozens of countries across the world because we have rigorous evidence as to what works. So we're always on the lookout, Marian, for context in which we're able to use a randomised rollout in order to learn about the impact of a program.
So basically, with ethical committees and the fact that we never have enough money to roll out anything to everyone, even if we think it might work, we are kind of safeguarding ourselves from those potential ethical dilemmas.
Absolutely. So, for example, when Australian households were given cash payments in the global financial crisis, the government randomised the postcodes on which they would be allocated and sent them out in a random order, which then allowed researchers to look at the impact of receiving one of those household payments on their spending patterns. It was entirely ethical. Indeed, you can argue that it's better to do the rollout based on a random selection rather than have some sort of political meddling in the process. And it allowed us to learn something about the marginal propensity to consume from government payments.
So many of our listeners are part of continuous randomized controlled trials and they probably don't know it. Can you tell me about a moment when you've seen evidence-driven decisions make a real difference in policy or in people's lives?
Perhaps the biggest impact is whether or not people who are being allocated malaria-treated bed nets should be asked to pay for them. So there was an early argument made by some in the international development community that if people didn't pay for their bed net, they wouldn't value them and they wouldn't use them. Instead, they'd use them as fishing nets or as wedding veils. This was an argument put as recently as the early 2000s by William Easterly. And then a series of randomised trials across Africa showed quite rigorously that free bed nets were taken up at a higher rate. Not surprising, because free things are more attractive than things you have to pay for, and that they were equally likely to be used. So you could save many more lives through allocating bed nets on a free basis than asking for co-payment. That immediately changed the behaviour of donors and has had the impact of saving hundreds of thousands of lives, particularly of young children in malaria-affected regions.
One of the many things I love about Randomistas is how you encourage people to experiment and make decisions based on evidence. Since publishing the book, have there been any recent experiments that have influenced how you make decisions, either personally or in politics? And more broadly, how can everyday people use data and experimentation to make better choices in their own lives?
Absolutely. There's an example that I use in Randomistas. So I talk about how multivitamins don't seem to have any beneficial impact for your health. And indeed, a large meta-analysis published shortly before I wrote Randomistas in 2018 had shown that mortality rates were a smidgen higher for people taking multivitamins. So, not wanting to send myself to an early grave, I stopped taking multivitamins. But then just recently, there has been another study that comes out that shows for people my age, middle-aged people, that taking multivitamins could well have a positive impact on cognitive health and doesn't seem to have any adverse impact on physical health. So I've then switched back to taking multivitamins. It seems to me that it's worth doing. The evidence, we need more studies, more randomised trials of multivitamins, but the cognitive impact on these recent studies have been quite large, and in that sense seemed worth changing my behaviour for.
That's very interesting, because you're taking from the physical effects now to studies on the cognitive effects, and you can change your mind as the evidence evolves itself.
It's a lovely way of putting it. Esther Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize, or shared the Nobel Prize for her work on randomised trials, once said, I don't have very many strong opinions. My only really strong opinion is that things should be rigorously tested.
And I completely would agree with that. Andrew, thanks so much for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure learning more about your book, Randomistas, and how experiments continue to shape the way you understand the world.
Well, thank you, Marian. It's been a treat to join you on Embracing Data. Good luck with the data analysis.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to another episode of Embracing Data.